There are clear signs when a unit is finished in war. Surrounding fire, broken command, ammunition gone, men running. None of those signs were present here. It was late in the war in Western Europe, and the German paratroopers holding this ground were still exactly where they were supposed to be. Their position was defensible. Fields of fire were measured. Approaches were covered. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing had given way. They were not trapped. They were not outflanked. They were not surprised. Their weapons were loaded. Ammunition was counted and conserved. Officers were alive, visible, issuing orders with calm authority. Communications still functioned. By every tactical measure that mattered, this unit remained capable of fighting and winning time. And yet the battle stopped. Not because of an attack. Not because of an order. But because something had entered the equation that did not belong there. Across the line, the paratroopers noticed a change first in sound, not sight. It was not artillery, not aircraft, not the familiar clatter of armor. The noise was heavier, slower, deliberate. It did not rush the battlefield. It announced its patience. Men rose slightly from their positions to look. Calculations were made, distances judged. Training took over and then stalled. Nothing they had prepared for fit what was coming. No shells landed, no bullets flew. Still, movement drained from the line. The rhythm of combat, advance, fire, response, simply failed to begin. Seconds stretched. The silence became oppressive rather than reassuring. Then something unprecedented happened. A single figure stepped into view without firing. His hands were raised, not in panic, but in certainty. Another followed. Then another. White cloth appeared where rifles had been moments earlier, not everywhere at once, but enough. This was not surrender born of defeat. It was surrender born of recognition. Before a single shot was fired, these men had reached a conclusion. Whatever was approaching, it had already made fighting meaningless. And the war, for them, had just changed shape. German paratroopers were trained to remove hesitation from combat. From the first day, speed of decision mattered as much as accuracy. Under fire, there was no room for doubt. Action, even imperfect action, was preferable to pause. This principle was drilled until it became instinct. Their doctrine reinforced that instinct. Volkskommandos units were expected to operate cut off, surrounded, or outnumbered. Isolation was not an emergency condition. It was an assumption. Initiative replaced reliance on higher command. Junior officers were trained to act independently, to fight without reassurance, and to hold ground long after other formations would have withdrawn. Experience validated that belief. These men had fought in battles where casualties were severe and conditions brutal, yet cohesion held. They had absorbed bombardment, endured shortages, and continued to resist. Withdrawal came only when ordered. Surrender, as a concept, was not part of their professional vocabulary. Allied intelligence understood this well. Reports consistently described German paratroopers as disciplined, stubborn, and resistant to shock. They were categorized as units unlikely to surrender, even when their tactical situation deteriorated. This reputation shaped Allied planning. Positions held by paratroopers were approached with caution and often with reluctance. Their identity was built on defiance rather than survival. Endurance, not preservation, defined success. To give up ground without exhausting, every option was considered failure, not just of nerve, but of purpose. Men were taught that holding on mattered, even when the outcome was no longer in doubt. Surrender, therefore, represented more than a battlefield decision. It contradicted training, doctrine, experience, and reputation simultaneously. It cut across everything these soldiers believed about themselves and their role in the war. That is what makes the moment so difficult to explain through conventional measures. There was no collapse of command to justify it, no overwhelming firepower that made resistance physically impossible, no sudden catastrophe that erased choice altogether. The usual explanations do not apply. which leaves only one conclusion. Whatever confronted these men did not defeat their position. It defeated the logic that told them how to fight. And to understand how that happened, it becomes necessary to step back from the men and examine the battlefield problem that forced such an outcome. By 1944, the war in Western Europe had settled into a pattern that frustrated both sides. The sweeping movements of earlier campaigns were gone. In their place emerged a landscape broken into hardened fragments, pockets of resistance that refused to dissolve quickly. The front no longer moved in broad strokes. It advanced in increments, measured in fields, crossroads, and ruined buildings. Towns, farms, and road junctions became miniature fortresses. Stone walls, cellars, hedgerows, and improvised earthworks turned ordinary ground into defensive strongpoints. Each one demanded attention. Each one delayed the advance. German units no longer sought decisive engagement, they sought friction. Every hour they held forced the Allies to spend men, time, and ammunition. This approach reflected a conscious trade. Space could be surrendered. Time could not. German commanders understood they no longer needed to win battles outright. They needed to slow the enemy, exhaust him, and complicate his timetable. A single platoon, positioned correctly, could delay an entire formation. That economy of force became central to late-war defense. For the Allies, this created a grinding problem. Advances slowed dramatically at these nodes of resistance. Plans built on momentum stalled in villages measured in hundreds of meters. Infantry assaults succeeded often enough, but at a steady cost in lives. Progress was paid for yard by yard, room by room. Armor offered power but not solutions. Tanks could suppress and isolate positions, but they could not reliably clear them alone. Dug-in defenders survived bombardment and re-emerged once the steel moved on. Combined arms worked, but required time and coordination the battlefield increasingly denied. By the end of 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Victory was no longer in doubt, but its price remained negotiable. Commanders began to ask a different question. Not how to destroy these positions, but how to make them stop resisting. Somewhere behind the lines, that question was already being answered in a way few on the battlefield yet understood. Tanks followed expectations. They fired shells that shattered walls and kicked up dust. They advanced cautiously, wary of unseen infantry. Their presence was intimidating, but familiar. Familiarity reduced fear. Familiarity restored calculation. This familiarity also carried an unspoken assumption that the next tank would behave like the last. That engagement would unfold within known distances. That time would exist to react. That even under pressure, there would be options. It was an assumption built slowly, reinforced by survival. What the paratroopers could not see and had not yet learned was that one Allied vehicle had been designed specifically to escape those expectations. It did not rely on precision or penetration. It did not demand proximity, and it did not require the defender to make a mistake. It simply removed the space in which courage and coordination had once mattered. And when that assumption failed, confidence failed with it. German paratroopers understood Allied tanks not as abstractions, but as studied threats. They had learned their shapes, their sounds, their habits. Through training manuals and battlefield experience, armor was broken down into components: engagement distance, turret rotation speed, reload time, blind arcs. Steel, however imposing, followed rules, and rules could be exploited. For the Fallschirmjäger, this knowledge was practical rather than theoretical. They had fought tanks in villages, on roads, and across open ground. They knew how close was too close, and when proximity became protection. Movement patterns were memorized. Hesitation was punished, but decisiveness often paid off. Close-range anti-tank weapons restored balance. Panzerfausts and grenades turned narrow streets and broken walls into lethal funnels. A tank that advanced too confidently could be blinded, immobilized, or destroyed by a single well-timed strike. Infantry did not need superiority. They needed opportunity. Courage and coordination still mattered against steel. Past encounters reinforced this belief. Allied armor had been repelled, delayed, and destroyed before. Even when tanks survived, they were often forced to withdraw without infantry support. The lesson absorbed by German defenders was clear. Tanks were dangerous, but they were not decisive on their own. They could be endured. They could be managed. This confidence shaped behavior. Positions were held longer. Ambushes were planned closer. Risk was accepted because experience suggested it could be controlled. The presence of armor did not automatically signal defeat, it signaled a problem to be solved. And in most cases, the solution worked. Within that environment, one proposal resurfaced with renewed urgency. It was not new and it was not subtle, but it addressed the problem directly. It did not rely on attrition, it relied on inevitability. The weapon promised to collapse resistance without prolonged combat, to force defenders into a decision quickly before courage, discipline, or doctrine could reassert themselves. It was effective, unsettling, and difficult to ignore. Approval came quietly and with hesitation. No one pretended this solution was elegant or comfortable or even admirable, but the data was clear and the calendar unforgiving. The war demanded speed, not perfection. Somewhere away from the front, a familiar tank was about to be changed, not to fight better, but to make fighting unnecessary. By late 1944, Allied casualty reports began to tell a story that maps and communiques could not. Resistance was being reduced, but rarely broken outright. German positions did not collapse suddenly, they eroded slowly. Each engagement succeeded in isolation, yet the cumulative cost was higher than planners had expected. The war was being won, but inefficiently. Firepower was abundant. Artillery leveled buildings. Tanks shattered walls. Infantry advanced behind both. Yet defenders often endured long enough to inflict losses before yielding ground. Killing power alone was not producing the speed the campaign required. The problem was not access to violence, but its effect. This forced a reconsideration at higher levels of command. Analysts began separating physical destruction from psychological outcome. They noted that many German units fought on not because they believed they could win, but because they believed resistance still had meaning. As long as defenders felt they retained agency, the ability to choose, to delay, to impose cost, they continued. That realization shifted the question entirely. If resistance was sustained by belief rather than capability, then firepower alone was an incomplete solution. What was needed was not a weapon that killed faster, but one that compelled decisions sooner. Something that removed the illusion of control before casualties accumulated on either side. Engineers were asked to revisit concepts that had once seemed impractical or excessive. Ideas previously shelved for being inelegant or uncomfortable were reconsidered under a new lens. The goal was no longer refinement. It was decisiveness. British armoured doctrine, shaped by years of adaptation and necessity, allowed room for this kind of experimentation. Unlike formations bound tightly to tradition, British units had already integrated unusual vehicles, mine-clearing tanks, bridge layers, demolition variants, each designed to solve a specific battlefield problem rather than dominate all others. Crews were not briefed on kill counts. They were not instructed to measure success by destruction. Instead, emphasis was placed on effect. The weapon's value lay in what it compelled defenders to do or stop doing. Fire was not meant to clear positions by annihilation, but to collapse resistance before it hardened. This distinction mattered. The Crocodile was not intended to duel tanks or outshoot artillery. It existed to confront a different problem entirely, the stubborn refusal of defenders to disengage when logic said they should. In that sense, it was less a weapon than a message. And when it finally rolled forward into combat, those on the receiving end would realize something unsettling. This tank was not designed to win firefights. It was designed to make fighting pointless. The vehicle entered service without ceremony. There was no announcement, no dramatic unveiling, no attempt to mythologize its arrival. On paper, It was simply another variant assigned to an already crowded battlefield. Most Allied soldiers encountering it for the first time saw nothing remarkable, just a familiar silhouette moving forward with the rest of the armor. At its core was the Churchill tank, a design shaped by earlier failures and hard lessons. It was slow by modern standards, but deliberately so. Its strength lay not in speed or firepower, but in protection and persistence. Thick armor allowed it to endure punishment that would cripple lighter vehicles. Its suspension and track system were engineered to cross ground others could not: rubble, mud, shell craters, and broken terrain where infantry stalled. The modification that defined this variant did not alter those fundamentals. It added something else entirely. The main gun remained, but it was no longer the vehicle's primary purpose. Instead, a flamethrower was integrated into the hull with careful engineering rather than improvisation. The system was pressurized, controlled, and designed for reliability under combat conditions. This was not a crude battlefield adaptation. It was deliberate. What made it truly disruptive was range. German defenders expected flamethrowers to be short-distance weapons, dangerous, but limited. This assumption was wrong. The Crocodile could project flame far beyond what infantry or fixed defenses anticipated. Positions thought secure suddenly were not. Distance, once a safeguard, became irrelevant. The external fuel trailer extended that threat over time. It allowed sustained use without frequent withdrawal, changing endurance calculations entirely. Where earlier flamethrower systems were brief and situational, this one could dominate an engagement. It did not need to rush. It could wait. The most revealing detail, however, was not mechanical. Within seconds, communication failed. Shouted orders were swallowed by noise and panic. Runners hesitated to move through ground that was no longer merely dangerous, but uninhabitable. Officers recognized the problem immediately and just as quickly understood that doctrine provided no answer. There was no maneuver to counter it, no tactic to adapt, no waiting it out. The defensive position had been designed to absorb violence, not to endure heat and oxygen loss. Training had prepared these men for chaos, for fear, for shock, but always within a framework where resistance still mattered. Here, resistance changed nothing. The Crocodile did not need to advance. It did not need to expose itself further. Its presence alone reshaped the battlefield. The defenders were not being defeated piece by piece. They were being displaced from the fight altogether. What collapsed was not morale in the traditional sense. It was logic. The internal calculation that told a soldier when to hold, when to fight, when to endure. That calculation had relied on the assumption that effort translated into effect. Now it did not. The realization spread unevenly but decisively. Men who had endured bombardment without flinching now looked at one another, searching for instruction that could not be given. The position could still be occupied. It simply could not be defended. And in that moment, the truth became unavoidable. There was no countermeasure, no adjustment, no next move. The doctrine that had carried them through earlier battles had met something it could not absorb, and the fight, as they understood it, was already over. The German paratroopers prepared for the approach the way they always had. Ambush positions were selected with care. Anti-tank weapons were distributed along likely routes of advance. Fields of fire were mapped not on paper, but in memory. Each man understood his role, his distance, his timing. This was familiar ground, and familiarity bred confidence. They expected armor to announce itself the usual way, by noise, by caution, by the gradual probing that preceded contact. Engagement distances were estimated accordingly. The first shots would come close, too close. That was where infantry mattered most, where courage and coordination could still tip the balance. That assumption failed almost immediately. The tank did not advance into range. It halted sooner than expected, well outside the distances the defenders had prepared for. There was no rush, no attempt to close the gap. From the German perspective, the vehicle appeared to pause, almost as if hesitating. Then it fired. The weapon was not a shell, and it was not limited by the short reach the paratroopers associated with flamethrowers. A sustained jet of flame surged forward, longer and more controlled than anything they had trained against. It crossed open ground effortlessly and poured into positions that moments earlier had felt secure. The effect was instantaneous. Trenches that had protected men from artillery and small arms became conduits for heat and smoke. Dugouts trapped air rather than shielding it. Corners, angles, and depth, the geometry that defined defensive fighting, ceased to function. There was no safe direction to move, no posture that reduced exposure. This was not an escalation of familiar danger. It was a transformation of the environment itself. Men reacted on instinct, but instinct offered no solution. Anti-tank weapons were useless at that distance. Small arms fire had no relevance. Even returning fire felt irrational, almost absurd, against something that did not require accuracy or line of sight. Not the kind celebrated in doctrine or memoirs, but the simplest and most uncomfortable kind. To remain in place and suffer for no effect, or to abandon resistance before suffering began. Honor, duty, and reputation pressed in one direction. Biology and reason pressed in the other. Fire made that tension impossible to ignore. It stripped the battlefield of abstraction and reduced it to fundamentals. Air, heat, time, the metrics by which soldiers usually measured success, ground held, shots fired, losses inflicted, became secondary to whether the next breath would be possible. This was no longer a tactical problem to be solved through ingenuity or resolve. There was no clever adjustment to make, no new formation to adopt. The variables had collapsed into a narrow equation with a fixed outcome. Survival now depended on recognizing that equation early enough to act. And as that recognition spread through the position, resistance began to lose its meaning, not because the men had lost their will, but because the fight itself had ceased to offer any purpose at all. Fire does not test training the way bullets do. It does not reward discipline or punish hesitation in familiar ways. It bypasses drills and doctrine and moves directly to instinct. Against it, the careful habits learned over years of service offer little guidance. What mattered seconds earlier, spacing, angles, timing, suddenly loses relevance. Positions that had been chosen for protection now worked against the men inside them. Trenches confined heat and trapped smoke. Dugouts, once life-saving, became sealed spaces where air thinned rapidly. Walls reflected flame inward rather than stopping it. The very features that had defined a strong defensive position now magnified danger. Courage offered no protection. Bravery could not lower temperature or replace oxygen. A soldier could will himself to stay under fire, but not to breathe when the air itself was failing. The body reacted before the mind could intervene, overriding training with an urgent demand to escape. Within moments, communication began to unravel. Shouted orders dissolved into noise. Signals were missed or ignored as men focused inward, measuring breath and heat rather than command. Radios, if they functioned at all, carried fragments of information without context. Control did not disappear dramatically, it simply slipped out of reach. Officers recognized the shift almost immediately. This was no longer a question of holding ground or inflicting losses. It was no longer about buying time or delaying an advance. The calculation had changed entirely. Casualties were no longer inevitable. They were optional, but only briefly. Every second of resistance now increased the likelihood of injury without improving the tactical situation. The logic of endurance, so deeply ingrained, no longer applied. Staying did not strengthen the defense. It only narrowed the margin for survival. This realization carried a weight of its own. For soldiers trained to endure hardship and absorb punishment, choosing not to fight felt unnatural. Yet the evidence was immediate and undeniable. No maneuver could improve conditions. No weapon could be brought to bear. No reinforcement could arrive in time to matter. What remained was choice. The tank did not need to move any closer. It had already achieved its purpose. From its position, it dominated the battlefield without advancing a single meter further. The threat it posed was no longer theoretical, and it no longer depended on action. Its presence alone dictated what would happen next. German officers understood this almost immediately. Their attention shifted away from maps and sectors and toward seconds. Not minutes, not phases of battle, seconds. They assessed how long the air would remain breathable, how quickly heat would spread, how little time remained before injury became unavoidable. The calculation was no longer historical or symbolic. It was immediate. Resistance offered no advantage now. Holding the position did not delay the enemy in any meaningful way. It did not inflict losses. It did not improve the situation of adjacent units. Every additional moment of defiance produced only one result: more suffering without consequence. This was not a decision shaped by fear alone. It was shaped by clarity. These men were trained to endure hardship when endurance served a purpose. Here, it did not. The weapon confronting them did not reward bravery or punish hesitation. It simply imposed conditions that could not be altered by will. No formal order was shouted. None was required. Officers did not need to explain what every man already understood. The chain of command remained intact, but it was no longer issuing tactical instructions. It was acknowledging reality. One man moved first, cautiously into view. His hands were raised not in panic, but in certainty. Others followed, measured and controlled. Weapons were set aside deliberately. White cloth appeared against the smoke and dust, unmistakable in its meaning. This was not collapse. It was conclusion. Across the position, resistance ended not because the paratroopers had been defeated in battle, but because battle itself had ceased to offer any rational path forward. And with that realization, the fight ended before it could begin again. The Allied infantry did not rush forward when the surrender began. Experience had taught them caution. Sudden quiet often preceded counterattacks, feigned retreats, or concealed fire. Weapons remained trained on the position as small groups advanced slowly, scanning for movement that did not fit the pattern. What emerged instead was unexpected. German soldiers stepped out in an orderly fashion, weapons lowered, hands raised with deliberate control. They were disciplined, uninjured, and visibly shaken. This was not the aftermath of a firefight. There were no burning vehicles, no shattered defenses, no bodies marking a final stand. The position had simply stopped resisting. For the men witnessing it, the effect was unsettling. Strongpoints that had held up advances for hours, sometimes days, were neutralized in minutes, without a single exchange of fire. The absence of violence made the outcome feel almost unreal. Reports moved up the chain of command quickly. Unit after unit described the same pattern: resistance collapsing before engagement, prisoners taken without casualties, objectives secured intact. What had been considered an unusual outcome began to look repeatable. The implications were immediate. Casualty curves shifted. Infantry losses dropped where the weapon was present. Timetables tightened. Operations that had been expected to grind forward instead flowed. The battlefield, so recently defined by friction, suddenly offered openings. Commanders recognized what this meant. The weapon was not simply effective at the point of contact, it was efficient across the operation. It saved time, preserved manpower, and reduced uncertainty. It did not need to be everywhere. It only needed to be present enough to influence decisions. Deployment expanded carefully but deliberately. The crocodile was assigned where resistance was expected to be strongest, not to destroy it, but to prevent it from forming at all. What had begun as a tactical experiment was now reshaping operational planning. And on the opposite side of the line, German commanders were beginning to realize that something fundamental had changed, and that they had no answer for it. The first reports reached German command channels cautiously, almost apologetically. Isolated incidents, unusual circumstances, local failures. But as the days passed, the pattern became harder to dismiss. References to flame tanks appeared with increasing frequency, often accompanied by the same unsettling detail. Resistance had ended before combat fully began. Warnings circulated down the chain of command. Units were advised to remain alert, to expect unfamiliar armored threats, to harden positions where possible. Yet the guidance was vague, because no effective counter had been identified. Traditional anti-tank measures addressed steel and penetration, not heat and confinement. Doctrine offered no immediate remedy. Morale began to degrade, not uniformly, but decisively. Some units dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others took them seriously enough to alter behavior. That uneven response only deepened uncertainty. A threat that could not be clearly defined proved more destabilizing than one that could. Rumor did the rest. Stories moved faster than formal orders ever could. Entire positions were said to have surrendered without firing a shot. Men spoke of trenches that turned lethal, of air that vanished in seconds. Whether every account was accurate mattered less than the fact that they were believed. In several cases, positions gave way before contact, not because defenders had lost discipline, but because they had learned from others' experience. Defensive depth, the idea that resistance could be layered and prolonged, began to lose meaning. If the first line could be made irrelevant instantly, what purpose did the second serve? German command faced an uncomfortable reality. Firepower was no longer the decisive factor. The battlefield was being shaped by anticipation rather than engagement. Fear, once a byproduct of combat, had become a primary driver of outcomes. The crocodile did not need to be present everywhere. Its reputation was enough. And as that reputation spread, German planners were forced to confront a new truth. The enemy had found a way to apply pressure without fighting, and the front was beginning to yield under that invisible weight. Among Allied crews, the crocodile was not spoken about with pride. It was respected, relied upon, and often quietly avoided in conversation. The tank gave formations an advantage that was difficult to deny, but also difficult to describe without unease. Fire felt different from bullets or shells. Conventional weapons destroyed through impact and fragmentation, brutal but familiar, almost clinical in their logic. Fire did something else. It altered the environment. It took away the defender's sense of choice. It worked not only on bodies, but on instinct, reaching beneath training and discipline in a way that most soldiers found hard to forget. The effect was immediate and absolute. When the weapon was used, outcomes arrived quickly. Resistance ended. Positions emptied. Strongpoints that might have cost dozens of lives to clear were neutralized in minutes. Tactical problems became administrative ones: prisoners, routes, and consolidation. German prisoners often described fear rather than injury. Many were physically intact. Their accounts did not center on wounds or casualties, but on what they believed would happen next if they remained. The weapon's power lay as much in anticipation as in contact, in what it promised rather than what it had already done. Commanders debated necessity privately. In a war measured increasingly by casualty tables and timelines, an instrument that reduced both seemed justified. Yet few men could pretend it was emotionally neutral. Even when used lawfully, it carried the weight of something primitive, a method older than modern armies, brought back into mechanized war with industrial efficiency. Legality offered no emotional relief. Being permitted to do something did not make it comfortable to witness. Some crews hesitated before firing, not out of doubt about effectiveness, but out of awareness of what it would mean for those on the receiving end. And still, the weapon remained in demand. Because efficiency in war is never purely technical. It is moral as well. It saves lives on one side and forces unbearable decisions on the other. The crocodile's advantage was real, and that reality came with a cost that did not appear on any map. Where the crocodile was employed, the statistics shifted quickly. Infantry casualties dropped in assaults that would otherwise have required prolonged clearing operations. Urban fighting, once measured in days and blocks, shortened dramatically. Streets that might have been contested room by room were secured intact. their defenders choosing capitulation over destruction. German units, for their part, preserved lives through surrender. Men who would likely have been killed or maimed in conventional fighting instead walked into captivity. In purely numerical terms, the exchange favored survival on both sides. Fewer bodies were counted. Fewer families received telegrams. The machinery of war moved more efficiently toward its end. This efficiency mattered. Time was the most precious commodity of the late war. Every shortened engagement tightened Allied schedules, preserved momentum, and reduced the window in which resistance could reorganize. The cumulative effect was subtle but decisive. The war did not end because of the crocodile, but it moved faster because of it. Yet numbers tell only part of the story. Psychological scars remained where physical ones did not. Fire left memory even without wounds. Men who surrendered described the experience years later with a clarity that outlasted other battles. The sensation of heat, the loss of air, the moment when calculation replaced courage, these impressions did not fade easily. For Allied crews as well, the cost was carried inward. Ending fights quickly did not always feel like victory. There was relief, but also unease. The absence of resistance raised questions that gunfire usually silenced. Victory arrived, but without simplicity. The crocodile had saved lives and shortened battles, yet it had done so by forcing decisions that no training manual could fully justify or condemn. It delivered success without celebration. And as the war receded into memory, that ambiguity would remain, a reminder that not all advantages feel like triumphs, even when they work exactly as intended. After the war, flamethrower tanks quietly disappeared from frontline doctrine. They were not banned, nor were they repudiated. They were simply not repeated. In the vast post-war rethinking of mechanized warfare, the crocodile stood apart, effective, proven, and yet uncomfortable in ways few other systems had been. Military doctrine began to shift in a different direction. Precision replaced proximity. Distance became the preferred solution to risk, both tactical and moral. Guided munitions, improved artillery coordination, and later air-delivered weapons promised control without intimacy. The lesson absorbed was not how to recreate the crocodile's effect, but how to avoid needing it. In staff colleges and analytical papers, the vehicle survived as a case study rather than a template. It demonstrated something unsettling, that fear, applied correctly, could replace firepower, that resistance could be collapsed without destroying the defender physically, that the battlefield was as much psychological terrain as physical ground. At the same time, it revealed limits that technology alone could not resolve. The crocodile worked precisely because it confronted soldiers with conditions no training could normalize. But that same quality made it difficult to justify in peacetime abstraction. It asked armies to accept effectiveness without reassurance, success without moral clarity. Technology, in this case, had outrun comfort. The engineering problem had been solved, but the ethical one had not. Post-war planners preferred systems that could be discussed cleanly, diagrammed neatly, and defended easily. Fire, with its primitive finality, resisted that treatment. And yet the lesson did not vanish. It lingered quietly beneath later doctrines that emphasized shock, speed, and dislocation. The idea that battles could be won by breaking cohesion rather than destroying forces would resurface in different forms, under different names. The crocodile had simply arrived too early and too honestly to be embraced. Its legacy was not a line of descendants, but a warning embedded in memory. That there are moments when victory is achieved not by overwhelming strength, but by removing the enemy's reason to fight, and that such victories, however efficient, leave questions that outlast the war itself. The surrender of elite troops marked something larger than a local success. It signaled a quiet turning point in modern warfare. These were not exhausted conscripts or shattered remnants. They were disciplined soldiers, trained to endure and resist under conditions designed to break lesser units. When they chose to lay down their weapons, it suggested that something fundamental had shifted. Not all battles, it became clear, were decided by destruction. Some were decided by inevitability, by the moment when outcomes no longer depended on courage, skill, or sacrifice, but on recognition, when the future could be seen clearly enough that continuing to fight served no purpose at all. The crocodile did not defeat the Fallskärmjäger in combat. There was no decisive exchange, no final stand, no dramatic collapse. Instead, it removed the framework in which combat made sense. It took away the assumptions that had guided training and doctrine for years, that effort could change outcomes, that endurance could buy time, that bravery could still matter. In that sense, the men survived, but the doctrine did not. What had been rendered obsolete was not discipline or professionalism, but the belief that every threat could be met with resistance. Fire, applied deliberately and without urgency, exposed the limits of that belief. It showed that some technologies do not need to overpower an enemy. They only need to convince him that resistance is meaningless. This realization lingered long after the war ended. It shaped how later generations thought about shock, fear, and decision-making on the battlefield. It reminded planners that the human mind is not an infinite resource, and that there are conditions under which even the most disciplined soldiers will choose survival over symbolism. They had trained their whole lives to fight bravely. Fire made bravery irrelevant. And in doing so, it changed the war not by force alone, but by redefining what it meant to fight at all.